That shift turned out to be unexpectedly tough for April. In the morning, she drove a family of 3 to the airport, then took a young woman to the college campus, and after that, she had to move the client's belongings to their new place of residence. In such cases, the best solution would be to hire a small truck. However, for some reason, the client chose to use a taxi service instead, which caused April quite a bit of trouble. Of course, there was no way for the client to know that the woman driving the cab was 3 months pregnant. She wasn't showing yet, which was why April could work as much as she wanted. She'd broken up with her fiancé, and the separation was extremely hard for her. But she couldn't live with the cheater, and her opinion on this matter remained unchanged. David left her as soon as he found out that she was pregnant. Then he tried to come back a month later, but it was already too late. Seeds of doubt and mistrust had already taken root in April's heart. Now the woman knew that she really could never rely on David. Without a steady job, he drifted between his girlfriends like a ship in a storm. Such a life didn't appeal to April, who had grown up in an orphanage and valued strong family bonds more than anything else. Moreover, she wasn't willing to forgive infidelity, especially not in David's case. She'd been working as a cab driver for about a year. At first, when she joined the transportation company, the garage manager right out laughed at her. "Are you really planning on working here, sweetheart? Keep in mind that only men work here, so no one's going to babysit you." "I don't expect anyone to. Just give me the opportunity to do the work I love, and you won't regret it," April retorted. At first, the other employees were skeptical about her, a female driver. And in the taxi service at that, it seemed crazy. Wanting to get rid of the annoying young woman as soon as possible, the garage manager gave her the oldest car with a bunch of malfunctions that didn't only require repair work, but a lot of parts to be replaced altogether. The plan was simple. April was supposed to get tired of the constant repairs and would quit her job before even starting her routes. But the garage manager underestimated her. April didn't give up. Moreover, she spent about a month working with the mechanic to make sure the car was in proper condition. At first, the other employees simply laughed at her, but then they realized that the young woman wasn't about to back down. Thus, inadvertently, April gradually blended into the male team, which became like a family to her. Now that she had proven her competence, no one dared to mock her anymore. April always did her job well, making sure that there was no reason for her to be ashamed of her performance. She was always courteous and exceptionally polite with her clients. And when she encountered unruly passengers, she quickly put them in their place without violating their civil rights. Despite being pregnant, April tried not to take any days off, aiming to save up money for all the future expenses related to the birth of her child. That day, she completed a few orders and was headed to pick up her next customers from a house on Park Street. Having arrived at her destination, April turned off the engine, letting it cool down for a bit. The client wasn't out yet, so she could take a short break. Having waited for about 10 minutes, April honked her horn 3 times before getting out of the car and headed towards the house. The young woman rang the doorbell and listened. She could hear the sound of footsteps coming from inside the house. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried. Soon the door opened, revealing an elderly woman in her 80s, dressed in an old-fashioned dress. "Hello, ma'am. Did you call for a taxi?" April inquired politely. The old woman smiled shyly, then playfully touched her forehead with her hand. "Right. I'm sorry, miss. I did call. But then I started going through my things and got distracted. You see, I'm moving today to a rather unpleasant place." The smile slowly faded from April's face. If the place was unpleasant, why did the poor elderly woman have to move there? April was tempted to ask her client about it, but she held back. "Excuse me, could you help me with my suitcase?" the old woman asked cautiously. April smiled and nodded. Of course, she wasn't supposed to lift anything heavy in her position, but fortunately, the suitcase didn't weigh a lot. As soon as April helped the client load her belongings into the trunk, she helped her get settled in the front passenger seat. "Oh, it's so nice here. I haven't been in a car in a very long time," the old woman said with delight. April smiled. To her great surprise, she realized that the elderly passenger refrained from using a taxi service because of her poverty. As April later found out, her client's name was Barbara Simpson. During their conversation, she constantly referred to April as dear, causing the young woman's heart to tremble with tenderness and delight. April was raised in an orphanage and never knew her parents, so unfortunately, she was never treated with such kindness. Having given April the address, the old woman turned to the window and started looking out, watching the city, the billboards, and the passers-by bustling around. At that moment, April caught herself thinking that Mrs. Simpson had lived as a recluse for quite some time, and now everything seemed novel to her. Soon, the old woman grew more animated, pointing out familiar places and telling April about them. "I used to work here, dear, and this bus stop here. That's where I met my husband, George. And in that unassuming building, which is now a store, I used to live with my friend, Sarah. But now, all of that is in the past." From her client's stories, April concluded that Mrs. Simpson didn't have any relatives left. Being childless, the elderly woman devoted herself to her husband, and when he passed away 5 years ago, she voluntarily locked herself within the 4 walls of her house. No, she did go out to get groceries, of course. But that was where Mrs. Simpson's connections with the outside world ended. Looking at April, the passenger fell silent for a moment, then asked, "Could you drive me around the city for a little longer, dear? Just so I can have one last look at the places where my life used to happen." April smiled. "Of course, Mrs. Simpson. Let's make the most out of it, shall we? I want you to enjoy this ride." At that moment, April felt like a guide giving a private tour to a client she had grown fond of. They drove around for about half an hour, after which Mrs. Simpson suddenly grew somber and asked to be taken to her destination. "What's that place? I've never been to that part of the city," April inquired, cautiously. Mrs. Simpson sighed sadly. "That's where my new home is, dear." April fell silent, sensing a shift in her client's mood. Mrs. Simpson remained quiet the rest of the journey, gazing out the window with a sense of unease. Then a gray 3-story building with the red-tiled roof came into view. Only then did April realize what was located at that address. "It's a nursing home, dear. This is where I'll be living out the rest of my days," Mrs. Simpson explained. April looked at the old woman with undisguised tenderness, then gently pushed away her hand with the money. "No, it's not necessary, Mrs. Simpson. Consider it my gift to you." Tears welled up in the old woman's eyes. "Thank you, dear. You've been so kind. I'd love it if you could pay me a visit sometime." "Of course, Mrs. Simpson. I'll definitely stop by." April hurried to reassure her client as she helped her with her things. Despite its unassuming appearance, the nursing home turned out to be rather pleasant inside. There were many men and women of roughly the same age, ensuring Mrs. Simpson a wide circle of companionship. As for April, she left the facility with a heavy heart. She couldn't help but feel intense pity for the elderly woman left alone in her declining years. April's thoughts were consumed by her encounter with Mrs. Simpson for the rest of the day, and the next morning, April headed to the nursing home to see Mrs. Simpson. Needless to say, Mrs. Simpson was on cloud 9. Being new to that place, the woman still hadn't settled in and felt quite uncomfortable. "Thank you for visiting me, dear. To be honest, I didn't think we'd ever see each other again." "Oh no, Mrs. Simpson, I always keep my promises," April assured her. After chatting for a couple of hours, April went back to work. From then on, April started paying regular visits to Mrs. Simpson. Whenever she came over, she made sure to bring some groceries not found in the cafeteria and various little trinkets to lift the old woman's spirits. Inadvertently, April grew so attached to Mrs. Simpson that she started considering her as both her mother and her grandmother. 3 months had passed, during which Mrs. Simpson's condition deteriorated noticeably. April could no longer hide her growing belly, which always brought a sweet smile to Mrs. Simpson's face. For some reason, the young woman felt like Mrs. Simpson's condition would improve at any moment. But it turned out to be quite the opposite. That fateful morning, April was awakened by a phone call. Having answered the phone, she heard the anxious voice of the on-call nurse informing her that Barbara Simpson had passed away half an hour ago. "What do you mean she passed away? That can't be true," April exclaimed, still unable to believe what had happened. But the reality was just too cruel. In the near future, April had to handle Mrs. Simpson's funeral, a task that couldn't be called pleasant or easy. The following 3 days all blurred into one unclear picture for April. The morning events drained her energy, leaving her unable to work properly. It took about a month for April to recover. Then a lawyer arrived at her home and handed her a folded piece of paper. "Mrs. Simpson left you a letter. She asked it to be delivered to you personally." April nodded absent-mindedly and quickly skimmed through the note. As she read the letter, her face alternated between growing dark and then brightening up again, becoming even more attractive. In her posthumous message, Mrs. Simpson informed April that she was bequeathing her home on Park Street to the young woman. All the necessary arrangements had been made, and the documents were drawn up in accordance with all the legal requirements. At the end of the letter was a note underlined with a red line for emphasis. "If you ever decide to use the fireplace, dear, inspect it first, and only then start the fire." The phrase puzzled April. However, she wasn't all too eager to try to figure out its meaning. After moving in to Mrs. Simpson's home, April felt rather sad and lonely. However, she then realized that Mrs. Simpson wouldn't want her to cry, so she tried to pull herself together. The due date was drawing near, filling April's heart with anxiety and fear. As fate would have it, April's contractions started while she was at work. She called for an ambulance, praying that the medics would arrive in time. Fortunately, everything went well. Having arrived at the hospital just in time, April gave birth to a healthy, rosy-cheeked baby girl within an hour. She named her daughter Barbara in honor of the late Mrs. Simpson. Now that April had a beautiful little girl in her life, the pain of losing Mrs. Simpson seemed less acute. The next time April thought of Mrs. Simpson was in the fall, when she decided to start a fire in the fireplace. That was when she remembered the note and inspected the fireplace. When she did it, April found a niche in the brickwork containing some kind of bundle. Having reached in, she pulled it out and gasped. It was money, a lot of money, neatly packed in transparent cellophane for preservation. Apparently, the thrifty old woman had been saving up for a rainy day throughout her entire life, accumulating a substantial amount in the hidden stash. Tears welled up in April's eyes. Only then did she realize the gift that the departed woman had given her. Closing her eyes, she mentally thanked Mrs. Simpson, promising to use the money for a good cause. She kept her promise by renovating Mrs. Simpson's old house. There couldn't really be a better gift for Mrs. Simpson. After all, her home was a silent reminder that a very kind and good person once lived there.